Welcome to the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency's applicant briefing for the Public Assistance Program. This presentation is for the COVID-19 disaster declaration designated DR-4490. This disaster event was declared for the state of Missouri on March 26, 2020. The incident period for this declaration began on January 20th of 2020 and is ongoing. The declaration is currently for public assistance and strictly for emergency protective measures or Category B projects. The federal request for public assistance form has been made available for download on FEMA's website and can be submitted to the listed email address. If a subrecipient has an account on FEMA's grants portal website, they may submit their request for public assistance digitally. The request for public assistance form must be submitted within 30 days of the declaration date, March 26, 2020. Private nonprofits must submit additional documentation along with their RPA. We encourage applicants to download the FEMA Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide from the link provided. What is public assistance? Public assistance is a supplemental program for cost share, 75% federal, 25% non-federal. It is provided to state and local governments and certain private nonprofit organizations for response and recovery in a presidentially declared disaster event. Here we see the process for public assistance as it relates to the COVID-19 disaster declaration. We've had the governor's request submitted and approved. We have now had the declaration, and we are now involved in the expedited response portion of this. We are encouraging applicants to get signed up for the grants portal and submit their RPAs. RPAs will be reviewed for eligibility, and then damages will be identified that are related to the COVID-19 response. Projects will be formulated, reviewed and approved, and then funding will be made available. Please note, there will be no PDAs, there are no county thresholds to meet, there is no state threshold to meet for this disaster declaration for COVID-19. There are 4 factors of eligibility in the public assistance program. The first factor of eligibility is that an applicant or subrecipient must be considered eligible within the program. In order to be an eligible applicant, you must be either a state, county, city, town, or village, certain private nonprofit organization, or other state political subdivisions. For private nonprofit eligibility, private nonprofits need to operate either a facility that provides a critical service, such as education, utility, emergency, medical, or custodial care, or a facility that provides a non-critical but essential social service and provides those services to the general public, such as child care, rehabilitation, libraries, museums, zoos, and houses of worship. A critical service is defined as one that includes power, water, sewer, wastewater treatment, communications, and emergency services. Or the owner or operator of the private nonprofit that provides the non-critical essential social service has applied for a Small Business Administration disaster loan and has been determined to be ineligible for such a loan after denial. The private nonprofit can then apply to FEMA for possible eligible disaster expenses, or if they've obtained such a loan in the maximum amount for which the Small Business Administration determines the facility is eligible, but the loan does not cover all eligible permanent work costs. A private nonprofit must submit the Private Nonprofit Facility Questionnaire. It will be made available on FEMA's website. They must also submit a current ruling letter from the IRS granting tax exemption status or a letter from the state substantiating that they are a non-revenue producing nonprofit entity. They must also provide proof of ownership or legal responsibility, list of services provided in the facility and when and to whom, such as a calendar of activities. They must submit proof of the established purpose of the facility, such as a charter or bylaws and amendments. Some private nonprofits need not be open to the general public to be eligible for public assistance. Private nonprofits with questions should contact us here at SEMA for an eligibility determination from FEMA. The second factor of eligibility is they must have an eligible facility. We define a facility as something that is owned by a state or local government entity that may include any of the following types of facilities. A private nonprofit facility generally indicates an incorporation status filed as a 501c classification and may include any of the following: utility, educational, emergency, medical, or custodial care, including for the aged or disabled, and other essential social type services to the general public. The third factor of eligibility is that they must have eligible work. For this disaster declaration with COVID-19, only emergency work or emergency protective measures projects will be considered for the program. Those are defined as Category B work. For the COVID-19 declaration, only emergency protective measures, otherwise known as Category B work, are going to be considered for this disaster. For COVID-19, examples will include response and supplies, temporary staffing, sheltering, security, etc. The final factor of eligibility is that we must have eligible costs. Generally, costs that can be directly tied to the performance of eligible work are eligible. Such costs are, according to 2 CFR Part 200, must be reasonable and necessary to accomplish the work, compliant with federal, state, and local requirements for procurements, reduced by all applicable credits, such as insurance proceeds and salvage values. It is essential that you accurately document the expenses incurred in disaster response and recovery operations. Accurate documentation will help you to recover all of your eligible costs, develop your disaster projects, validate the accuracy of your small projects, and prepare for federal, state audits and financial reviews. Costs must be reasonable. You must review your invoices prior to payment. Check for inconsistencies. Please understand that costs incurred or paid are not always a reimbursable expense. A reasonable cost is one that is both fair and equitable for the type of work being performed. Reasonable costs can be established through a variety of means. There should be no duplication of benefits. FEMA cannot provide funding that duplicates insurance proceeds. FEMA cannot duplicate funds provided by another federal agency. Grants and cash donations from other sources may only be used towards the non-federal cost share or PA ineligible work. Procurement. In performing work, applicants or subrecipients must adhere to all federal, state, and local procurement requirements. Normal procedures must not be altered because of the potential for reimbursement from federal funds. Local procurement procedures must meet or exceed state and federal requirements. Procurement procedures must be in writing, adopted, and implemented per 2 CFR Part 200. For contracting, normally the non-federal entity must take and document all necessary affirmative steps to assure that minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms are used when possible. However, FEMA has issued guidance that is specifically applicable to DR-4490, in which awarding agencies may waive procurement requirements contained in 2 CFR Part 200 regarding geographical preferences and regarding contracting with these businesses. Contracts must be of reasonable cost, must be competitively bid, and must comply with federal, state, and local procurement standards. You must have copies of contracts, bid tabs, and identification of your selected contractor available, and they must be provided to SEMA and FEMA prior to the reimbursement of funds. For procurement under grants conducted under exigent or emergency circumstances, it is important to remember that it is essential for all non-state entities to understand that both FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General closely review procurement actions and contract selections. They will be looking for situations where there are non-competitive procurement actions, and they will be evaluating it for compliance with federal requirements. Subrecipients must provide SEMA with written justification for the selection of a contractor other than the lowest bid prior to the awarding of the contract. SEMA will provide a written response regarding the eligibility of the selection back to the subrecipient. The below sites can be used to determine whether or not a contractor is listed as a debarred contractor. The revised statutes of Missouri provide that no business entity or employer shall knowingly employ, hire for employment, or continue to employ an unauthorized alien to perform work within the state of Missouri. FEMA may reimburse costs incurred under a time and materials contract only if all the following apply. No other contract was suitable, the contract has a ceiling price that the contractor exceeds at its own risk, and the applicant provides a high degree of oversight to obtain reasonable assurance that the contractor is using efficient methods and effective cost controls. FEMA does not reimburse costs incurred under a cost plus percentage of cost contract. or a contract with a percentage of construction cost method. Contracts contingent on FEMA reimbursement are strongly discouraged and may jeopardize funding. For labor cost eligibility, force account labor is performed by the applicant's employees rather than by a contractor. It is claimed at an hourly rate and in accordance with your existing written policy. Labor rates include actual wages paid plus fringe benefits paid or credited to personnel. For reassigned employees, labor costs for employees assigned to perform tasks that are not part of their normal jobs is eligible as long as the reassigned employees are performing eligible work. For emergency work, only overtime is eligible. The pay rate is based off the reassigned employee's normal rate of pay, and those pay rates must be reasonable. Temporary employees are extra personnel hired as a direct result of the disaster to perform eligible work. For example, additional nursing staff temporarily hired to respond to COVID-19. Reasonable wages paid to temporary or part-time employees hired in response to COVID-19 who perform eligible emergency work are eligible, including straight time and overtime. For force account labor, an applicant must be able to demonstrate that the employee was directly involved with a specific project. This includes situations where an individual's time is normally charged to specific projects regardless of federal funding. Also, we want to track that they're incurring overtime for the employees in accordance with their labor policy and that it does not include a contingency clause that payment is subject to federal funding and policy is applied uniformly at all times. For compensatory time, or comp time, if a subrecipient has a policy for providing comp time in place of overtime, FEMA reimbursement will be based on that policy. For fringe benefits that are actually paid as part of the established policy are eligible. Because certain items in the benefit package are not dependent on hours worked, such as health insurance, the fringe benefit rate will be different for regular and overtime hours. Material costs. The cost of materials and supplies that were purchased or taken from a subrecipient's stock and used during the performance of eligible work are eligible. If available, actual costs for materials should be taken from invoices. If the materials were taken from stock and invoices are not available, costs may be developed from the subrecipient's historical data and by contacting area vendors. For donated resources, FEMA allows applicants to use the value of donated resources to offset the non-federal cost share of its eligible emergency work project worksheets. FEMA applies the offset regardless of the cost share arrangements between the recipient and the subrecipients, that being the state and local entities. In addition to overarching federal PA program requirements as defined in the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, the following policy language applies. The applicant may apply the offset if all of the following conditions are met. The donated resource is from a third party, which is a private entity or individual that is not a paid employee of the applicant or federal, state, or territorial or tribal government. The donated resource is necessary and reasonable for the accomplishment of the project. The applicant uses the resource in the performance of the eligible work and within the respective project's period of performance, and the applicant or volunteer organization tracks the resources and work performed, including a description, specific location, and hours. Additional rules may apply. For management costs under the Public Assistance Program, this is the interim policy that is effective as of August 1, 2017. The following procedures apply to all subrecipients that receive management cost contributions under the interim policy. Subrecipients may only request the initial Category Z project worksheet once projects have been obligated. The Category Z project worksheet will be based on the total award amount. The total award amount is the actual eligible PA project cost, including the non-federal share, after insurance and any other reductions. It does not include donated resources or other management costs. If and when a subrecipient requests a Category Z project worksheet, the Program Delivery Manager will formulate a Category Z project worksheet for 5% of the total award amount obligated for a subrecipient at the time of its request. FEMA may process amendments up to once a quarter for 5% of the total award amount obligated for the subrecipient at the time of the amendment request. Here we provided an example of how a Category Z project is formulated based on a calculated total award amount. If all final actual management costs are known at the time the subrecipient requests a Category Z project worksheet, The subrecipient should submit its claim for all eligible costs incurred, and FEMA will obligate the Category Z project based on the actual eligible costs up to the 5% maximum. If additional project costs are obligated or deobligated, FEMA will adjust the 5% maximum and the actual eligible costs as appropriate. An applicant should track and document all management costs. Subrecipients must provide that documentation to substantiate their costs claimed for eligible management activities. Additionally, costs claimed must be reasonable. For documentation requirements, an explanation of work performed with a representative sample of daily logs and activity reports. The activity must be related to eligible projects. Therefore, management costs associated with an appeal that is ultimately denied are not eligible. If an eligibility determination is appealed and the appeal is ultimately granted, that project is eligible for inclusion in the calculation of the Cat Z PW. And management activities associated with the eligible project costs are then eligible for reimbursement. Documentation should substantiate the necessity of any claimed office supplies, equipment, or space. For meetings, the activity description needs to include the number and purpose of the meetings. Travel costs need to include the purpose of travel and a copy of the travel policy. Training needs to include the location, dates, and title of the course. The training must be related to public assistance and occur within the period of performance of the Cat Z project worksheet. Subrecipients need to certify that the management activities and associated costs claimed are eligible, consistent with the interim policy, and not related to ineligible projects. For closeout and final reconciliation, all Cat Z PWs will be reconciled and reimbursed based on actual costs, not to exceed the maximum percentage allowed, which is 5% for subrecipients. This includes Category Z project worksheets that are below the large project threshold. Project formulation. Due to the rapid development of the COVID-19 pandemic, FEMA Program Delivery Manager resources will be assigned but may be utilized according to exceptional cost and/or urgency. Subrecipients should compile incurred costs that have been coded to COVID-19 with descriptions of work that have been complete and work that remains to be completed. This information will be submitted into Grants Portal for review and submission to FEMA's Consolidated Resource Center for project formulation. Grants Portal is the new PA delivery model or customer relationship management tool that has been implemented by FEMA. Here is a screen grab of the Grants Portal that you will be utilizing throughout the process. Here you can submit your request for public assistance form digitally. You will be allowed to upload all of your documentation related to your COVID-19 expenses to the portal directly using the document uploader utility. For the uploading of documents, we recommend that you collect copies of the following documents and upload them to the portal as soon as possible: your current payroll policies, your procurement policy, any primary source documentation that supports costs that have been or will be incurred as part of the response to COVID-19. There are two types of grants within the Public Assistance Program. The DR-4490 declaration includes only Category B emergency protective measures. Approved projects will be divided into two groups: large projects and small projects. So what is the difference between a large and small project? The large project threshold is currently $131,100. Any project that is at or above that amount will be considered a large project. For large projects, the federal cost share is obligated when the project worksheet is approved by FEMA. The final costs are based on actual documented eligible costs as applied to the approved scope of work. Final payment is made following project completion, site inspection, file review, and projects are closed by FEMA. For small projects, the federal cost share for a small project is paid upon project worksheet approval by SEMA and FEMA and receipt of all required documentation by SEMA. This is for any project that is under the large project threshold. The minimum amount for the small project is $3,300. Final costs are based on the approved estimate from the project worksheet of the project cost. Cost overruns are resolved in the aggregate. The scope of work on a project worksheet identifies the approved repair or replacement methodology and eligible costs for completing the project work. The subrecipient is responsible for completing the scope of work as specified. The subrecipient is responsible for informing SEMA of any condition that creates a need to change the scope of work before proceeding with the work. For project completion time limits, for COVID-19 and emergency work Category B projects, the initial project completion time period is 6 months, which is normal for emergency work projects. The state has the authority to grant limited extensions to these projects. FEMA has the authority to grant the remaining extensions. The subrecipient must complete work within the established regulatory timeframes and request time extensions as appropriate. Subrecipients must submit quarterly reports to the state for projects where work is not yet completed. And a subrecipient must not deposit grant funds in an interest-bearing account. If this occurs, the subrecipient must remit any interest earned back to SEMA. For audits and compliance, subrecipients must maintain records that identify the source and application of funds for financially assisted activities. Subrecipients must establish a project file or site file for multiple site projects, containing the approved corresponding subaward or project worksheet and all of the documentation pertaining to that project or the sites. Subrecipients must follow the same or more stringent internal controls when accounting for and expending disaster grant funds, as it does for its annual operating revenue. A subrecipient must maintain documentation by project, reconcile source documentation to invoices, and determine the validity of all project invoices before filing claims. Subrecipients must follow federal procurement standards as set forth in the Code of Federal Regulations 2, Part 200. Improperly contracted work may result in the total ineligibility for that project. Subrecipients will be required to sign the Audit Compliance Requirements checklist before any funds are dispersed. SEMA reserves the right, as the recipient, to conduct periodic reviews of any subrecipient records and to cease payments to any subrecipient found to be non-compliant with these requirements. Approval of your procurement procedures, cost documentation, source documents, etc. by representatives of the Federal Emergency Management Agency does not provide any assurance that auditors will not require that you return disaster grant funds should the Office of Inspector General disagree with those procedures. This information and procedures are the result of previous OIG audits within the state of Missouri. All projects are subject to a final project review. Accurate records of expenses must be coded for COVID-19 and maintained by subrecipients. For appeals, a determination related to federal assistance may be appealed. The time limit for appeal submission is 60 days from the receipt of notice of the action which is to be appealed. Subrecipients must submit written appeals to SEMA for processing. Remember, these actions will help you obtain and retain eligible funding in the shortest amount of time. The timely submission of forms, documentation, and quarterly reports. If there is any doubt, ask before committing resources. Contact us here at SEMA and ask questions. Maintain complete and accurate documentation by project of all COVID-19 related costs and comply with your written scope of work. Here is a list of recurring issues. Some of them include documentation of eligible costs, following approved established procurement processes in accordance with state and federal guidelines, oversight of projects and contracts, information flow to the public as well as the subrecipient, SEMA, and FEMA. You should submit to SEMA any written requests for change in scope of work, time extensions, large project interim payment requests, or requests for final payments. You should submit your forms, such as your quarterly reports or your project completion and certification reports. Any other documentation that is requested by SEMA or FEMA that supports your eligible costs. This concludes the overview of the Public Assistance Grant Program as it applies to the COVID-19 Disaster Declaration. Again, this information provided in this presentation is current as of March 30th, 2020. Here's the contact information for the SEMA Public Assistance section. To submit a non-digital RPA, please send it to this email address provided at the top. David Bergen is our section manager. He can be reached at the listed email or phone number. Our team leads are Karen Kastmeyer for the blue team, Matthew Boley for red team, and Regina Dredge for the green team. Here is a map of the state of Missouri showing the counties and how they are dispersed between the three teams. We'd like to thank you for viewing this presentation.